Every week, Sean brings me the weekly roundup in podcasting, what happened in the industry. Let's get straight into it. Sean, what happened last week in podcasting?
First up, I've got Tim Ferriss's new rules for podcasting. Tim Ferriss is one of the biggest names in podcasting. He got into the game really early and has seen massive success. Just last year, his podcast reached 1 billion downloads. And what he's noticing is that things have tipped over into podcasting being this huge thing where it's no longer enough to just show up and interview people. You have to start thinking about how to differentiate yourself. He came up with some rules about how to do this and how to keep things interesting in his podcast.
Hopefully we all remember the Tim Ferriss. I'm probably half of that billion. I remember the 4-Hour Work Week in 2007. And so big Tim fan, going to try not to fangirl. Now, he's an elder statesman of podcasting. There's a few of them around. It's interesting about the reinvention because I completely agree with him that please let's no longer have any more, hi, today we're talking to this guy that has a book coming out next month. And then we're going to talk about this and da-da-da-da-da. And at the end say, all right, you got a book recommendation aside from your own, of course. Oh, yeah, it's this. Okay, thanks. I hope you enjoyed that. Bye. Stock outro. Let's stop that. I totally agree with him. Things have to change when it comes to that. Differentiation, man. That's what happens when it becomes a crowded marketplace. It's differentiation. Because we can't have any of these anymore. We can't do it. We can't bring on the people with the book.
Just to back you up, Tim's first rule here is no more book launch episodes.
No way.
Same mind there, yeah.
Yeah, otherwise we're going to turn into a machine. Podcasts are promotion for people with stuff happening. The problem is that it's birthed from something else. It's birthed from what I think is like a personal stagnation that comes in podcasts. That's a natural thing. That comes with anything. Have you ever gone to the gym for like the first, second, third time you're figuring it out? For those of us that have been longer than 3 times, a very difficult feat, might I add. You get into a routine. I'm going to go, I'll do a deadlift, I'll do bench press. You get into that and you stagnate, man. You literally stagnate with that. And that's what happens with podcasts because you go, right, I need guests for content. I need guests for content. I need to put the content out. I need to make a short form piece and then I need to put it on the thing. Now I'm 400 episodes deep and I've got 400 advertisements for people with books out. What are we doing? What's the goal?
I think the problem here that I've seen is, let's take Tony Robbins, for instance. I got into this point where he was on literally every single podcast that I listened to. It was the exact same conversation. Nobody needs to hear that.
I would listen to Tony Robbins say the same thing over and over again, but that's fine. But no, I know exactly what you mean. It's like people have been doing like podcast tours. You know what I mean? Like I'm going to go on 17 million podcasts and say the same things. You can't fault that person for it. No, it's fantastic for them. They're winning by doing that. And you can't necessarily fault the podcaster for it. This person has authority in the space that I would like to suck the authority from him in order to do this. It makes sense as a linear step. It's not goal driven. It's not strategic. It's not aligned with what you should be doing. Maybe 1 or 2 is fine. It's fine if they have one. But if that's what you're doing, and I didn't want this to be a rant, it's bringing me on to another thing of like part of that stagnation, which we all know the people, it might be you listening, we all know the people that are 400 episodes in and you're using a service, and these services are absolutely fine, but the services that get you guests and the services that sign up to the ones that get you guests are the people that have a book to promote. And so you're like, I'll use a service. Now I've got 17 people that are going to come on my podcast. That's amazing. That's so much content. That makes me hit my goal. No, it doesn't. It makes you create content. There's a lot of content out there. So it's not necessarily the fault of the podcaster. It's not having that overview of why you're doing the stuff, the intentionality behind what you're doing. Do you know what I mean? You don't see Stephen Bartlett from Diary of a CEO bring on people that have a book coming out, but you do. It's an age-old thing. That's not his strategy. He has a strategy, and that's part of it, which is very different to not having one and bringing on people with books.
Yeah, absolutely. This somehow perfectly dovetails into the next strategy that Tim Ferriss has. He calls it the 90-10 barbell strategy for guests, focusing on the extremes. People who 90% or more of his audience know, like so huge, big names, people that are going to be recognized, people that viewers are going to want to turn in for, or people who like less than 10% of his audience know. So like lesser known names that he gets to give a platform and highlight. People are just getting exposure to the same name and the same ideas over and over again. They trust Tim, so they're showing up for these big names, and then they are also getting exposed to these other people who they've never heard before. And of course, Tim says his favorite episodes by far have been from the people who less people in his audience actually know about.
If that's your mission, to amplify those voices, it's amazing. Someone that does that very well is Theo Von. He had literally Donald Trump, and then I think like one of the next episodes or the previous episodes was like a bin man. What's American for bin man? Is that a thing?
Garbage man.
That's so interesting, man. Because, yeah, well, it all comes down to the strategy, but it's like your strategy then isn't relying on getting those guests. No one's strategy is I'm going to talk to bin men. They're listening for Theo, and he knows that, which is why he can bring the bin man on. I love that.
Yeah.
What's the second thing that happened last week in podcasting?
YouTube Music, which is by default installed on any Android phone, is now pulling RSS feeds for podcasts.
I think I'm seeing this as a kind of step in the right direction. What we really want is for YouTube to pull from RSS, which it half does at the moment. That's the future, where it's got your YouTube, including your videos, not just your audio podcasts, all in the one place, and all your stats all in the one place. I don't know much about YouTube Music, never used it. I use YouTube Premium. Maybe I have YouTube Music. I've never had a cause to use it.
Yeah, YouTube Music is, I don't know if I would recommend it if you're already using Spotify or something. It's a contender. I think we need to be aware of it as a platform.
That makes sense. I can see if you use YouTube a lot and you also want to do music, but you don't want to pay for Spotify and you don't want the ads, I assume YouTube Music probably has ads, but then you get it with Premium. I don't know. Yeah, I can see how it can work. And like these things happen where it's, there's a competitor. And then the competitor suddenly starts running a real good race. But that's not how I see this. I see this as a step in the right direction for really integrating YouTube and YouTube videos with RSS.
Absolutely. Next up is a press release from Realm, a podcast publisher that does kids and family podcasts. They found that 80% of these kid and family podcasts are listened to with the parents beside them in the car, maybe like at home on a public speaker, something like that. But yeah, they're co-listening to these podcasts, which creates a big opportunity for advertising. In the same way you would think about like kids shows, they'll have the commercials that are aimed at getting the parents to buy something for their kids or something.
I don't know, I'm thinking about it in two ways. Like, you know how like a new thing comes around and then the parents are always like, oh, that thing. And then the new thing comes around. Oh, I imagine they said one time, TV's going to ruin the younger generation. Gaming's going to ruin the younger generation. They were so right.
They're always right.
Oh, of course. But now we're the parents. There's that side of me that's like, man, when I'm in the car with my kids, they're not old enough for podcasts yet anyway. I mean, they don't even watch TV. We're one of those families. But it's like, I don't know. I want to stick on some music and have a sing-song, or I want to chat about stuff and stuff like that. I don't want to go down the whole, they're ruining our children, because it's not that. It depends how you use it. You could be watching educational stuff. You could be listening to educational podcasts. That's great. It could be an interactive thing. So I'm not going to go down that route. However, the advertisement bit, I don't know how I feel about that. I remember advertisements when I was a kid on TV, and it was like Transformers, stuff like that. I'm not that old. It was the newer Transformers. But in the UK, there were loads of regulations that came in. I think they may have had that in the US, but probably not. They rarely do that thing. But we had some regulations of what you can and can't. Like, they can't advertise any type of sugary product to kids. It's not allowed. And I think that's interesting. Maybe it's a thing that needs, or that maybe has. If it doesn't, then it needs some regulation on it, of course. Yeah, I'm not against it. I quite like that they have that ability now. So that's cool. I've yet to formulate how I feel about that. Can you tell?
I can tell. And I agree. I feel pretty mixed on it as well. I think overall, I'm pretty anti-advertising, but I also know that advertising is the way that 99% of the internet is funded. There's really no way around that. But what I do love is that we're seeing more of the rise of the option to pay to bypass these advertisements.
Yes.
Like, I can't remember the last time I've watched a commercial, really.
That's a great point.
YouTube Premium. That's
I couldn't live without
example.
it. My wife puts it on the TV. She signs out of my thing just so I don't have Brazilian workout videos on my home feed. I wish she wouldn't do that. No. So, but yeah, she does that. And every time it's on the TV, halfway through a workout, there's an advertisement. I'm like, come on, man. This is an off-topic thing. But A, do you think that's the way that podcasts will go? YouTube has gone that way, as we were just talking about. And B, I was going to say, do you think that will hurt creators? But then it doesn't necessarily hurt the creators of YouTube. It does a bit, but like they get the funding from the premium, if you will. So maybe that will be more of the model that it turns to. I could see that in the future. What do you think?
We're definitely seeing the capability for that already with Apple Podcasts and several other platforms supporting subscription feeds. I do think that's the big approach that podcasters are taking is let's have this subscriber feed where you either get the episodes a week early or you get them without ads. I do think that's a really good model because in general, it's still a pretty good value for the listener. For a show that they're supporting, they probably only pay $1 to $2 for an episode, something like that, to get an episode without ads. Also, for the podcasters themselves, for the creators, if you get 1% of your audience is paying you $1, that's probably still more than you would generally get for the like pay-per-click advertising.
For sure.
You know?
Yeah, the CPMs are insane. So yeah, that's definitely a better model for the creators. And like, I'm wondering if there'll be a model where it's like, as opposed to a on a show level subscription, more of a, you can subscribe to Apple Podcasts Premium or whatever. There's no ads whatsoever, but each creator gets a share of that type of thing. That could be very interesting, because that kind of switches a lot of people's goals on their head. A lot of people talk about monetization, CPMs, advertisement. That will be different if everything's just premium. Obviously, there'll still be ads. Everyone's not on premium, of course. But if that's a part of it, it'll be based on listenership. People are going to have to start thinking about content a lot more.
I think when you're not focused on the strict listener numbers, you're focused on getting those super fans, the ones that are willing to pay $1 to $2 an episode to support the show. Those are going to be so much more valuable than just getting 1,000 other listeners, providing much more specific value to a narrower audience.
Yeah, which is how it should be, because otherwise we're left with a million entrepreneurship episodes where they talk to Tony Robbins about the same questions. We're looking into the future of monetization there. But all of that aside, we all know that the best way for monetization is to bring it in-house. You know what I mean? Like, for up to a certain level. Obviously, if you're the Tim Ferriss, that's the plural of Ferriss, then you're going to be looking at your bulk stuff. You've got 1 billion downloads, CPMs. You can figure it out. Up to that level, best monetization is taking it in-house. Whether that's courses, whether that's your own book launch, whether that's bringing people into your own ecosystem, that's always going to be the best way up to a certain level.
Now we're on to our fourth headline for the week. So last week in podcasting, some new analytics showed up that paint a continuing trend for Apple Podcasts. It is now at its newest low point as far as podcasting goes, which is surprising when at one point Apple Podcasts was like 80% of the entire podcasting market.
Do you remember telling everyone that 4 or 5 years ago? Like,
yes,
people go, hey, what should we be looking at in our things? Are you going to be looking at Apple Podcasts as 80%? That was just part of what we said, because that's what it was.
They're down to 45%.
Wow.
Last year at this time, it was 66.
That is sharp. Wow. Okay. I would imagine there's a correlation between its downfall and Spotify's growth. I remember when Spotify was like your 5% type of thing. It'd be interesting to know what Spotify's at right now, but I'd imagine they correlate.
Spotify is at 21.9% right now.
Wow. Okay.
So in August of last year, Spotify was at about 15%.
Monopolies aren't held forever is probably the biggest reason. Everyone catches up, and the person in front has to innovate significantly more than everyone else in order for everyone else not to catch up, because everyone else's innovation is times by the amount of people there are. So that's interesting. That's just, it's inevitable, is one of the biggest things. The other thing is, when I think about it on a more personal level, I don't use Apple Podcasts. I think I switched over a couple of years ago. Now I'm Spotify. What are you?
I'm Overcast, which I know is an odd one. It works with the way that I listen to podcasts.
Very interesting. For me, the reason I went to Spotify is that I use an iPhone, and there's Apple Podcasts natively, which is cool, right? But there's also the music app natively, which is fine. Now, I don't want to pay for Apple Music and have Apple Music and then have a separate app where it's, okay, now I want to listen to a podcast. What I do is I get to the gym and I go, open Spotify, my one place for content, apart from YouTube that needs the RSS. Am I going to listen to a retrospective of Red Dwarf, or am I going to listen to Slayer? It's the integration. I might be going out on a limb here, but am I wrong in saying that the iPhone, whatever it is on right now, is very similar to the iPhone, whatever it was 3 years ago?
That's a fair assessment, yeah.
Do you remember back when the iPhone 10 came out? And it was like, no way, it's that shaped. There was so much innovation. But now I know people that have been Apple for decades that are now Samsung. There's more innovation there. I may be wrong, but I'd imagine that there's a move away from Apple in general.
There definitely is globally.
Yeah, rise of international markets. I live in Brazil. If you have an iPhone, you're one of few. Most people have Samsung or Chinese phones or whatever. You go to Ghana, you ain't seeing a lot of iPhones. You totally are, but you're seeing more of the other ones. Where do you think it goes from here? What do they do? Are they going to innovate, or are they going to get got by the competitors?
They have to innovate, but also I don't know how much they care. Apple practically invented the podcast. Pod was for iPod. Now it just seems like they're kind of coasting. They've had people into podcasts by default, but podcasts themselves are growing so much now. The audience is getting a lot savvier, and I think that they're aware that there are more options available to them. They don't have to go with the app that's just preloaded on their phone, especially when it's not the best one out there.
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? The best one out there. People are loyal up to the point where the other thing has more benefits. Motorola invented the phone, the mobile phone, I believe. I want to say Motorola, potentially. What was the last one? Razr? No, they still do more, don't they? But no one cares. Why does no one care? Because they have iPhones. And that's what happens. The natural destiny of this is they continue to fall without them doing anything to counteract that. A lot of Samsungs are being sold. So then they need to bring those people over. How do they do it? It needs to be better. How can it be any better? There can be minimal things. Now we have chapters. Okay, that's pretty cool. It's not worth me changing though. They can't use those monopoly tactics. Kind of what Spotify did. You want to go Joe Rogan, you know what I'm saying? That's a monopoly tactic. They could use those and it would be fine, but it's not longevity. Interesting.
Yeah.
Let's continue to watch and see what happens.
Let's close this out with recently there was news about the closure of Chartable, which is one of the biggest statistics providers for podcasts, and was purchased by Spotify, I believe, last year. I know we've used Chartable in the past to pull up some statistics for our clients. Now we're left wondering what's next because people want to know. People want these analytics. They want to know what's happening with their podcast, what their listenership looks like.
I would see it less of a closure and more of a, it's been taken into Spotify now. That's getting big, man. Spotify for podcasters. I remember when it was a thing that was clunky to log into that gave you like terrible stats. I remember those days. That wasn't that long ago. And now it's like a fully fledged thing. They add in DAI and you're looking interesting. So yeah, what was my point? Yes, so Chartable, that was it. That's just making it even better. That is a monopoly tactic of let's have all the podcasts, or a lot of the podcasts, come from Spotify. And then when they've got that happening, what can they do with that to further that monopoly? Very interesting from the Swedes, coming back from behind. Yes, we've used Chartable. Their stats are okay. On a broad level, it goes back to the mission and the goal and your strategy behind your show. If your goal is to bring people in to sell a course to them, a lot of the things don't necessarily matter. If your goal is to sell something specifically in Ghana, that's the second mention of the episode, then it doesn't matter how many US listens you've got. It doesn't matter what you are in the chart to a certain point. And so it has to be viewed through that lens, because I think we've all been there, and I'm very much the type of person to fall into this, chasing those stats. Everything is stats. We need to raise this stat. What metric am I looking at? KPIs, etc. There's nothing against KPIs. I love them, but they've got to be the correct ones. Like when I first started a podcast, it was like, do you remember New and Noteworthy? Those are the days. New and Noteworthy, no way.
That used to be like the game.
Get yourself reviews at the start, back when reviews meant things. That was amazing. Yeah, and I remember like the charts, I could see myself going up the charts, hit number 1 in travel, thank you very much, and going up the charts, and then that was lovely. That was fun. I enjoyed that thoroughly. It did nothing for my mission, but I enjoyed it thoroughly. Got to be viewed through that lens. All of this statistic stuff, and to be honest, a lot of the industry stuff has to be viewed through that lens of, oh, there's this little tiny thing that does this thing. Man, forget about it. Do you know what I mean? It's worth 1% of your growth to your mission. So this is why the way that I get my industry stuff is through this, because I know you will only bring me the most important things. I'm on a different rant now. Yeah, so Chartable. I've always recommended bringing it in-house. Chartable pulls from many things, but through its very nature had its limitations. You have all of that data, and I would recommend pulling it in. Ask ChatGPT what an API is. Pull in all that stuff to a spreadsheet. God, I love a spreadsheet. You've got it there, and you can actually use the data. That's what I would recommend throughout all of this. However, I am the founder of a podcasting production agency, so that's my avatar. I am not the avatar of 95% of podcasters, which is I am a podcaster, I talk into a mic. So I appreciate for them, they want to go to a certain space and they want to go at a glance, how am I doing? What are my goals, etc. So I appreciate that. I would say for the general person, what you have within your podcasting provider, should we say, go to them, see what they got there. You're kind of all right. You can see your trends, focus on the one KPI, dial in on that you really need. That's fine for everyone. Am I wrong?
Of course, the answer is always depends on what your goals are. But I do think people get focused on maybe the wrong metrics a lot of the time. What are some of those things that people should be paying attention to as far as the tracking goes?
Depends on the goals. Next question. Let's use like a broad goal that everyone comes with, which is I want to, and this is a mistake, I want to grow my listenership, therefore growing my authority in the space, and then X, Y, Z. That's right, we say Z. So the key things you want to look at there is you want to grow your listenership, yes, but how cool is it to have 100,000 listeners per episode? Very cool. How useful is it? Depends on the goal. If your goal is to develop authority in the area of looking around for areas, Buddhism, some art, but your 100,000 listeners for some strange reason are all skateboarders, not very useful, right? So how do we measure for that? Then you're looking engagement. Let's say you have 100,000 people that are into Buddhism, right? What would that look like? Those people are your 100,000 true fans. You got to ask yourself, what are you a true fan of? And how do you interact, if you do, with that thing? I think I've done maybe 6 YouTube comments in my life. But those things I am a huge fan of. And I know I'm not a normal person. I'm aware of that. That is me showing engagement with these things. I'm also subscribed to some things that, I can take it or leave it. I'm not the ideal person for that. They're not going to grow with me. Yes, I'm a number on their subscriber count, but if they want to monetize me through anything other than CPM, then I'm not the guy that's going to help them. But if one of these other ones does, I am the guy. I will buy I'm on Patreons. Do you know what I mean? That's what you want to look at. Maybe you skip the numbers stuff and you think, yeah, I've got 100,000 listeners, fantastic. But maybe you look at, if you've got a Patreon set up, how many of those converted to patrons? There we are. Patrons. I find that people have difficulty with what is a person that subscribes to your Patreon. It's a patron. It's one of those terms that kind of came from something, but people think it's a new thing, like hash. Hash was always a thing. You guys don't say hash, right? Which is probably why you don't know it's a thing.
I do not know it's a thing.
That makes sense. This confused me. The Offspring, 1998 album, I'm going to say. Americana. Fantastic album. And before one of the songs that we used to listen to on repeat because it said the F word and I was like 10 years old. Amazing. It said, please make your selection followed by the £sign now, which is like a thing. That's an American thing. But me being an English 10-year-old, I'm like, make your selection followed by the £sign. So you're buying something. They're using pound sterling. I had no idea what it means, but that's hash, isn't it?
That is hash.
So, yeah.
Yes.
So we grew up with hash.
I'm very glad that we didn't land on pound tag.
Yes, you're so right. What were we talking about? Stuff that comes from other stuff. Yes, that was it. Patrons. I would measure the actual metric that you want to measure. I know that's a simplification, but it's like the amount of listeners isn't what you want. Like, you got to ask yourself the question, if I maximize this KPI, is that in line with my goal? Yes, it will get you closer. Yes, it will do the other things, but what's the step beyond? Look at the next thing would be my advice.
I think that about wraps it up.
Thank you very much for being here. Thank you very much for listening. And Sean, thank you very much for giving me the industry news, as you always do. Back next week.
All right. See you next week.